to our third panel, which has undergone a small change. As you will recall, Joanna Michlitz and Lukasz Krzanovsky switched places. So there is a change in the program and also ensuing a change in perspective. But overall, we will continue to address a similar set of questions. We have three very distinguished speakers in our third and last panel. The last speaker doesn't need any more introduction. Anthony Polonsky, who is being celebrated today, was already introduced earlier in a variety of ways. Our first speaker in this panel is Lukasz Krzyzanowski, one of the emerging voices on Holocaust research from Poland, who has pursued a research project on Jews returning to their hometowns in the immediate aftermath of the war. This monograph, or the monograph based on the dissertation, was published in Polish in 2017 and 18, and the English version was now just very, very recently published by Harvard University Press under the title Ghost Citizens: Jewish Return to a Post-War City, looking at the regional capital of Radom. Lukasz has also produced several articles and chapters in the wider context of this research. Our second speaker is a much more senior voice and internationally known in a variety of roles. First of all, as a contemporary historian with a very distinguished research track record, writing about the history of migration in post-war Poland, and also contributing with very substantial and significant research on the history of the last major anti-Semitic campaign in post-war Poland in March 1968. Dariusz Stola is also known as, well, is probably better known internationally outside of academia as the first director of the Plein Museum of Jewish History in Warsaw. He ran an exceptionally successful term as director, and I think it is safe to say that he would not have objected to continue in this role, but we are not going into the questions why this is not the case. The overarching topic of this last panel is politics, obviously, as we have already understood from the presentation of Professor Polonsky. The implications of the ways in which we engage with the history of warfare and the Holocaust is deeply framed by political issues. The first presentation by Lukasz Krzanovsky will offer a first entry point to these questions. So, Lukasz, I invite you to the floor. Your presentation is entitled "Brothers and Sisters Joined in Pain: Survivors Commemorating Victims of the Holocaust in Provincial Poland Immediately After the War." And Lukasz is already sharing his screen. The floor is yours. Welcome, and we look forward to hear you.
Yes.
Yes. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francois, for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this session. I must admit that although we swapped places with Professor Michlitz, we didn't swap the topics of our talks. So I'm more into memory than politics. Thank you very much. Well, I feel truly honored, and I feel grateful and happy to be part of this symposium, because I think that today we are celebrating not only an amazing scholar, a prolific author, and one of the founding fathers of the field of Polish Jewish studies, but also a very generous mentor to so many young historians. And so thank you, Professor Polonsky, for bringing us together. All of these survivors that returned to Poland in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War were marked by the Holocaust. Even individuals who lived through the war in the depths of the USSR were touched by the experience through the fates of their nearest and dearest. Thus, the cultivation of remembrance of the victims of the final solution played a pivotal role in the integrating the Jewish communities. Particularly so in provincial Poland, in Radom, an industrial medium-sized city that I researched and which will be mentioned several times in this paper, but also in smaller localities, such as Ostrowiec Świętokrzyski, as evidenced in this collective photo of Jewish returnees to Ostrowiec taken on October 11, 1945. These people stand on the grounds of the city's Jewish cemetery near the mass grave of the victims shot during the liquidation of the local ghetto that had taken place exactly 3 years earlier. Organizing annual commemorations and amassing proof of the crimes committed against the Jews during the German occupation served the need of integrating those who survived. Such activities were undertaken across Poland by the Jewish committees, branches of the Central Committee for Jews in Poland, and the local divisions of the Central Jewish Historical Commission. In some places, separate institutions dedicated to commemorate the victims were established. In Radom, it was the Committee for the Celebration of the Memory of the Jewish Martyrs of Radom. Communities of survivors residing in central Poland, away from a few big cities and away from the Western territories where the post-war Jewish life concentrated, were rapidly shrinking in size. Therefore, the same individuals often were active in different institutions. Activities connected with commemoration also made the presence of the Jewish survivors communities in provincial post-war Poland visible. In many Jewish communities in all of Poland, the annual observances were organized to commemorate the beginning of the so-called Great Action, the largest deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto, and the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Jewish Committee in Radom organized the first formal ceremony commemorating the beginning of the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto on July 22nd, 1945, several months after liberation of the city and 3 years after the tragic events in Warsaw. After the victims were commemorated by a moment of silence, a lecture was delivered describing the Great Action. A report about this ceremony informed that the speaker, quote, concludes his lecture with profound reverence to the memory of the mothers of children, the heroes of unprecedented events in the history of the world, and draws the only conclusion so dearly paid for in blood, that Jews must have their own country in order to stand on an equal footing with other peoples. Afterward, Tuwim's letter, We the Polish Jews, and Broniewski's poem, To the Polish Jews, were read, end of quote. It is worth recalling that Julian Tuwim's passionate essay is a manifesto of the poet's double Polish-Jewish identity, and Władysław Broniewski's poem contains a message that the sky will shine down above demolished Warsaw for both Poles and the Jews. That the commemoration program contained a lecture with a distinct Zionist accent, as well as 2 literary works in which the connection of Jews with Poland and Polishness was underlined, confirms Irena Hurwicz-Nowakowska's, a sociologist and a survivor herself, thesis about the frequent appearance among survivors of a dual identity, with their ideological fatherland being a Jewish state and their private fatherland, Poland. According to Hurwicz-Nowakowska, Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust understood these concepts particularly well. Sometimes anniversaries served as occasions to meet survivors from other places and participate in observances elsewhere. Here, a survivor from Radom, Pola Weisfus, who traveled to Warsaw in order to participate in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemoration. Of all the ceremonies commemorating the Holocaust, most likely these were the observances of the anniversaries of the liquidation of the local ghettos that held the greatest significance for the local communities of survivors. The records of the District Jewish Committee in Radom indicate that the anniversaries of the main liquidation action of the small ghetto August 5th, 1942, and the large ghetto in the city center, August 16 to 17, 1942, were both observed. In addition to that, the anniversaries of the other deportations of Jews from the city were also remembered. The 5th anniversary of the liquidation of the Radom ghetto in August 1947 had a particularly poignant character. It coincided with the trial of Wilhelm Josef Blum, the man directly responsible for carrying out Aktion Reinhardt in the Radom district. Designated by Globocnik, Blum personally supervised the deportation of the majority of Radom ghetto inhabitants to the Treblinka extermination camp. The coincidence in the timing of the German war criminals trial and the ghetto liquidation anniversary was not accidental. The District Jewish Committee and the Central Jewish Historical Commission both petitioned the authorities with a request for the trial to be started on the anniversary of the deportation of Radom Jews. The request of the Jewish community met with a positive response. Blum's trial before the district court in Radom began on Saturday, August 16, 1947. 3 days later, the former deputy chief of the SS and police in the Radom district was sentenced to death. The local press wrote about the trial and recalled the history of the Holocaust in Radom. The trial of Blum became itself a form of commemoration of the victims of the Radom ghetto liquidation. In order to participate in the observation and the trial of the German war criminal, surviving Radomers residing in the other parts of the country came to the city. The Jewish residents of Radom sought witnesses who could testify to Blum's guilt and coordinated their travel to the city. It is difficult to find hard proof in the archives, but it appears that the survivors came to Radom not only to testify, but motivated by the need to be together. The anniversary of the liquidation of the ghetto was a moment of unity for Radom Jews, for those who lived in their native city after the war or had briefly returned to it, and for those who had left the Radom phase of their lives behind. For all of them, the world had collapsed in August 1942 with the deportation of their families to the extermination camp at Treblinka. On the anniversary of these events, they felt the need for communal mourning. Letters and telegrams sent to the District Jewish Committee testify to this. Nella Gutman, one of the surviving Radom young women, wrote from Kudowa. Dear brothers and sisters joined in pain, let us honor today those who perished at bestial hands, those who were near to us in soul and body. Wherever the wind carries us, let us unite on this day so as not to feel alone in painful memories, despite our loneliness. On Sunday, August 17, 1947, the day after the opening of Blum's trial, the Radom survivors organized a ceremony dedicated to the memory of the victims of the ghetto's liquidation. They were joined by the representatives of the municipal authorities, a rare occasion of actual interest of the municipality in the post-war Jewish population of the city. Honoring the victims of the Holocaust by surviving members of the community was manifested also in a desire to provide a proper interment at the local Jewish cemeteries to the victims buried in places where they had been murdered. Exhumations of war victims were very common in Poland in the early years after the war. While in the case of Polish Christian victims, it was most often the family that initiated the exhumation and took after the proper burial of a killed relative. In case of Jewish victims, who most often did not have surviving relatives, these were the communities of survivors and Jewish committees as their representatives who saw about the exhumations and burials. In 1946, the Jewish committee in Siedlce organized an exhumation of 90 individuals. The bodies were put to rest in the local Jewish cemetery. Further exhumations were carried out in 1948 in the city and its vicinity. Similar activities were undertaken by Jewish committees in other localities across Poland. In the spring of 1949, the Radom Jewish Committee organized an exhumation of Jews murdered in the Pionki gunpowder factory. Remains of 37 individuals were exhumed at the time. They were buried in the Radom Jewish Cemetery on May 9th. A day chosen for this burial happened to be a victory day. The survivors' community in Siedlce commemorated the victims of the Holocaust with a monument built on the site of the burial. The stone contained an inscription in 3 languages. Here rest the remains of Jews murdered and burned by the barbaric Nazis in Siedlce and its environs in the years 1942-1943, exhumed from the place of their extermination by the Jewish Committee on the 4th anniversary of the liquidation of the ghetto. We pay homage to their martyrs' death, the Jewish community in Siedlce on 22nd of August 1946. At the time, communities of survivors in other cities also erected similar monuments at the sites of mass graves in Jewish cemeteries. These were not only remains of the Holocaust victims, however, that were exhumed by the survivors. In numerous Polish towns and cities, surviving Jews made their efforts to recover Jewish headstones. Sometimes their local authorities required that the survivors pay or repair the damages they did to pavements and roads by recovering the matzevot. This photo presents Yontel Goldman, a chairman of the Jewish Committee in Siedlce, on one of the streets of the city where matzevot were used as curbstones. They were unearthed and recovered by the survivors. Tombstones that the Jewish communities across Poland managed to recover were later brought to local Jewish cemeteries. As their original location in the cemetery was unknown, and many of them were profoundly damaged, they were often built into the monuments. Here is just one example from Sandomierz. A white marble plaque in the center of the monument was vandalized and was replaced only very recently. In fact, multiple monuments in different parts of Poland were also destroyed, sometimes just days or weeks after they had been unveiled. Probably one of the most striking examples of such devastation was the one suffered by the monument commemorating Holocaust victims in Biała Podlaska, erected by the Jewish Committee there in the summer of 1946. Few weeks after the unveiling ceremony, the monument was blown up. Those responsible for turning the monument into a pile of rubble were never identified, let alone found or put on trial. In some localities in post-war Poland, building a monument signified the last collective effort of the local survivors community. This was the case for Radom, where after 3 years of petitioning the authorities and gathering funds, the survivors built a monument commemorating Jewish Radomers murdered during the Holocaust. It was located in a very symbolic space, at the square where the city's synagogue once stood and at the heart of the former large ghetto. The monument was designed and sculptured by Jakub Zajdenschnir, a professional artist educated in France, a Radomer and a Holocaust survivor. Also, this monument utilized a few matzevot that had been recovered from the streets of the city after the liberation. The monument was unveiled on August 17, 1950, on the 8th anniversary of the liquidation of the ghetto. During the ceremony, Zajdenschnir, representing the survivors, symbolically transferred the custody over the monument and the square to the municipal authorities. It was the last time the Jewish dwellers of Radom appeared together in public and acted as a community. Hence, the monument, which still marks the space, is a reminder of both the pre-war community that perished during the Holocaust and the short-lived community of survivors who briefly came together in the early post-war period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lukasz. As I put in the chat, I suggest that we take questions to Łukasz's presentation now, because there's a shift in perspective. And we have a first question by Jarosław Garliński, whether all survivors were all survivors middle-aged. It seems the question is probably motivated by the people, the persons we see on the photographs, who all seem to be between 30 and 45.
Should I respond immediately?
Yes, please.
Well, of course, they were not all middle-aged. However, there is a certain absence. So when I analyzed the age structure of the community of survivors in Radom, it became very clear that those who are missing are people who are elderly people. So I think the eldest person was not even 60.
Mm.
But I think that it might be the impression that they are all middle-aged. Some of them are in their late 20s, but they still look like they are middle-aged. So, but there is a difference and there are different studies that show that generally speaking, for those who survived in Poland, in the camps or in hiding, there is among the women that were in their late teens, 20s, and men were slightly older. And that's one of the explanations is that especially for Radom area, many of those who survived and appeared in the city in the first period after liberation, they survived in the German forced labor camps. Mm. In the almonds factories located around in the city and around the city. Some of them were evacuated very late, so that it enabled some of the Jews to escape. And some of them, like the factory in Częstochowa, were not evacuated at all. And these were the people who worked there.
Thank you for that. A question from Anna Solarska. How was the blowing up of the monument in Biała Podlaska reported in the press, locally or nationally? It was a bit before a very severe censorship took hold, and there might have been some press or other coverage.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for this question. It's a very good question. I must say that it's slightly a bit out of my expertise because I didn't research specifically Biała Podlaska. But I can say something more general. The Jews were most often absent in the post-war press. For example, for Radom, which I know much better than Biała Podlaska, the Jewish community was mentioned only during the anniversaries.
Okay.
Basically, during the unveiling of the monument, the burial of those that were exhumed from Pionki was mentioned, and the trial of Blum. And actually, the trial of Blum was very interesting because it was the only occasion where Jews were given their own voice. There were two articles that appeared out. They were authored by the survivor journalist from Radom, who described the liquidation of the Radom ghetto. And it was the only occasion that I was able to find where Jews were able to speak on their own in local press.
Yeah, you obviously your core expertise is on the post-war history of Radom, and perhaps you can answer the question of Caroline Slivkin. So who looked after the Radom monument after, as you mentioned, many Jews would depart the city? Was it well taken care of? Was it neglected? Who was responsible for taking?
Well, it survived, and I think that's it was not really taken care of, but it was not taken down. So it was the municipality that it still looks after the monument, which is now renovated, and it's and the square in which the monument stands is more or less taken care of. But in 1980s, 1990s, this part of this city was pretty dilapidated, and it's to some extent it still is. But the monument was not taken down. There were different. There was the idea that that the square that hosted the synagogue will be turned into the market square. So that the farmers market would take place there. But fortunately, it didn't happen. So it's but it still is one of the very few spaces that remind the contemporary dwellers of Radom of the Jewish past of the city.
Yeah. There's a question, perhaps the last question to you, Lukasz, from Magda, and obviously this question opens a can of worms, because this is probably you could now read your entire book. I was wondering, Magda asked, given the large contribution of Poles in the persecution of their Jewish neighbors, how did the relationship between the survivors and the Poles look upon their Jews' return or arrival? Were the attempts at bringing Polish criminals to justice initiated by the Jewish survivors? Was this issue somehow buried in silence by both sides? So perhaps
it's a massive question. I'll put it that way. One of the first chapters of my book deals with anti-Jewish violence in post-war Radom and the region, and I argue that the violence that the survivors met upon their arrival shaped their community in a way that they were forced to find a way or to work out a coping strategy that would enable them to live in the city, because not all of them wanted to leave immediately, and avoid the attacks. They were harmless. They were not protected by the authorities, who were reluctant to provide effective protection. So they became invisible in a way and that's why I call them ghost citizens, because they were in the city, but they were socially absent. They were not, for example, in the minutes of the municipal council, Jewish survivors appeared only twice in the whole history of post-war Radom. So they basically went underground once again.
Yes.
And that's why those commemorations are so important, because these are the very few moments where Jews as a collective, as a population, are visible in the post-war history of the city.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lukasz, for your presentation and answering the questions. I already see a small workshop appearing in next year of the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies, bringing together Agnieszka Wierzcholska's and your expertise in thinking about Polish-Jewish relations in this time of terror and its aftermath. So thank you very much.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to invite Dariusz Stola to the floor. I already introduced him briefly to the audience, and his talk could not be entitled in a more programmatic way and more promising way, Scholars and Coming to Terms with the Holocaust in Poland. No subtitle. That's a statement as a title. So Dariusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So first I would like to thank for the invitation to this seminar, the Symposium in honor of Antony Polonsky, and I have a special honor of having him on the same panel, speaking just right afterwards after me. But I also have a practical purpose in it, namely, I believe that Antony played a key role in the history I'm going to present you in the following 25 minutes. And namely, he played a key role in a certain evolution, the renewal of the Holocaust research in Poland, the renewal of the studies in Jewish history in Poland, which later on affected the public debates on the Holocaust in Poland in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So we have had Piotr Forecki speaking today, so I don't need to speak too much about the Polish debates on the Holocaust. He's the author of the most important, the most comprehensive book on the topic. Let me just mention that since late 1980s, Polish public opinion has engaged in several major debates about the Holocaust. Every few years, national media, historians, columnists, celebrities, political leaders, bishops, philosophers, as well as ordinary men and women felt obliged to speak up and write, often very emotionally, about the dramatic past events of the Second World War, and especially about the reaction of non-Jewish Poles to the Jewish tragedy, which was the main topic attracting the greatest attention in these debates. The debate following the publication of the book by Jan Tomasz Gross, The Neighbors, again, it's been mentioned a few times today, was the largest of these debates, and not only the biggest debate on the Holocaust in Poland, but the biggest debate on history in Poland ever. Now, Poland has various dramatic pasts, and some of them very recent, like the communist regime in Poland. But still, the debate on Jedwabne was the greatest, most intensive, and the longest debate on history in Poland ever, to my knowledge. And there were secondary effects to these debates, namely, the debates contributed to making new monuments or remaking monuments like in Jedwabne, opening exhibitions or even whole museums. I believe that the debates contributed to the eventual opening of the Plein Museum of the History of Polish Jews to some extent, to making new educational programs and works by writers, filmmakers, some of them outstanding, like Ida, and so on. And of course, they did contribute also to the development of Holocaust research in Poland, including the establishment of the Polish Center for Holocaust Research. So the debates were consequential. And I claim that historians played an important role in these debates. And if you believe this is a trivial statement, it's not trivial, because there were some debates related to the Holocaust in the same period in Poland when historians didn't play a major role. And these were the debates about Auschwitz and the presence of religious symbols in Auschwitz, beginning with the controversy around the Carmel Monastery, 1989, early 1990s, then the crosses in Auschwitz, crosses in religious symbols in the pit near Birkenau. And in these debates, historians played a very marginal role. So it's not obvious that historians play a role, but in some debates they did play a role, and these debates, I believe, had an impact on the wider public. So I believe that the scholarly contribution, the historian contribution to these developments was greater than providing factual knowledge on the past. This is what they were expected to bring. They brought something in addition to the factual knowledge. They brought and maintained a certain model of discussion, an academic model of scholarly debate, which differs from other models of public discussion, which I realized only in the last years when public debates in Poland has changed profoundly. They are now much different from the academic model and less productive. So this model incidentally fits with the definition of the authoritative Polish language dictionary, which defines a discussion as a conversation that is to lead to shared conclusion. That not all conversations are discussions meeting this definition, but academic debate is exactly a debate which is to lead to a shared conclusion. So let me now present some preliminary thoughts about how did this happen. And my claim is that a set of coincidences, including political circumstances at least two moments, combined with long-term efforts of Antony Polonsky, at a time when the renewal of the Polish Holocaust studies was taking place, contributed, and made, first, these were the circumstances that made historians have oversized influence in Polish public. And second, that these historians believed and practiced a special kind of history, which is not as obvious today as it seemed to me when it was happening. Namely, that the obvious kind of history is the critical academic history, which is produced in a transnational community of scholars. And the transnational community of scholars is not just an environment, but a certain mindset for a historian to work on any topic he or she is working on. And I would like also to put it in a longer perspective. Namely, I see the history of Polish debates on the Holocaust as a long process that began almost simultaneously with the Endlosung itself in the 1940s, still during the war, that had several stages. And it's going on, it's not completed, hopefully never be completed, which is not only conditioned by its topic. I mean, not only what happened during the war made the Polish debates on the Holocaust so intensive and emotional, it's also conditioned by the contemporary circumstances of the debates, including the freedom of speech, the nature of the public sphere and the shape of the freedom of speech, media infrastructure, what kind of media we use in these debates, and the wider understanding of what is and where is moral authority, which is shifting. So first, going to this historical precedents, the prehistory of the contemporary Polish debates on the Holocaust, we can find some traces of these debates very early on, and these are very practical questions. What's going on? That means what changed in the German policy against the Jews towards the Jews in 1941? How out of fragmentary knowledge about killings in individual localities in Eastern Poland, former Soviet zone of occupation, emerged a broader picture and a broader understanding of this new German policy as a policy of a total annihilation of the Jewish people in Poland and then continentally. That was a process that took months, if not years. And then relatively quickly on followed another question among non-Jewish Poles, which is, how should we react? What should be the proper reaction? Feasible, moral, a reaction that meets Polish national interests. And again, we had a number of answers, conflicting answers, at least divergent answers. And then we have some less practical but more profound questions that a beautiful example is the poems written by Czesław Miłosz in 1943, which are well known since at least late 1980s, when Jan Błoński took them again, especially the poem on the poor Christian looking at the ghetto. So we have this early stage of the debate still on the German occupation. The next stage of the debate was early post-war years. And again, now we have scholarship on this topic. We have articles on this topic, what happened, especially 1946, 1947, following the Kielce pogrom, which was a trigger for these debates. A number of prominent intellectuals engaged in what was likely the first European debate on the reactions to the Holocaust, before this name was even used in reference to the Jewish tragedy of the Second World War. It seems that scholars didn't play any particular role. Well, Witold Kula did take part in the discussion, but not as a historian, as a public intellectual. I believe war was simply too close at that moment to be seen as history. Second World War became history sometime later, and this is one of the questions. When the German occupation, the Holocaust, and the Second World War became history, that means the object of historical inquiry. And in Polish case, this is complicated by the Sovietization, the acceleration of the Sovietization or Stalinization of Poland, beginning in 1947, 1949, which ended the great effort at documentation. We have heard today about really remarkable efforts at registering the documents of the Shoah right after the war. So actually we can see again the re-emergence or the emergence of the historiographic inquiry into the Holocaust after 1956. And a good example is the remaking of Arthur Eisenbach's original book on Hitlerowska Polityka Eksterminacji, which was a highly Stalinist, I would say, highly ideological book. He then remade it to make it published in 1961 as Hitlerowska Polityka Zagłady Żydów, the Hitlerite Policies of Annihilation of the Jews in 1961 in Warsaw. By the way, simultaneously with Raoul Hilberg. I think it's really remarkable that you have the first comprehensive Polish study on the Holocaust in Poland. Of course, before it doesn't use the name Holocaust, but it's a systematic approach to the Holocaust. At the same time, when Hilberg publishes his book, and about this time in the early 1960s, we have a number of other publications, and well, it remains to be seen. It's an under-researched topic. What were the reactions? Was there any debate? What were the comments? It remains. I hope maybe Piotr Forecki will make it as someone who has the biggest expertise in researching Polish debates on the Holocaust. What I have found as someone who has spent some time working on the 1968 anti-Zionist campaign is that there are striking similarities between what we see in Poland today and with one event which was at the beginning of this anti-Zionist campaign, and that was so-called Great Encyclopedia Affair, namely the attack against the authors and editors of the Great Universal Encyclopedia, the biggest, most authoritative encyclopedic publication of Communist Poland, about the entry on the Nazi camps. So the authors and editors were attacked for alleged misrepresentation of history because they claimed that there were two different kinds of camps, the concentration camps and the death camps. So you may be surprised because this is what academic historians believe to the present, that the camps like Treblinka or Bełżec or Sobibor we have heard today were different from other camps. They were designed and made to kill people, not to keep the slave labor like concentration camps did. So for this reason, the authors were attacked, removed. But when you read closely, there is a book on this topic about the affair of Encyclopedia, 1967. By the way, it coincided with the Six-Day War and the anti-Israeli propaganda campaign. So basically, it seems the attack against the authors and editors was an attempt in a longer strategy to control the narrative of the Second World War and to silence alternative voices. By the way, one of the arguments used against them was that they said that the death camps were located in Poland to insinuate that there was a Polish complicity in the Nazi crimes. If this sounds familiar to those of you who follow contemporary Polish discussions on the Holocaust, I think it's quite remarkable. And these historians and editors were attacked for who they were, exactly for the academic knowledge that did not fit with the feelings of the broad masses and the Polish national interest. I'm almost quoting members of the inquiry committee that was established by the Communist Party at the time. So it sounds very contemporary. The first new debate, the one which is at the origins of the series of contemporary Polish debates in the Holocaust, is a debate that followed the Claude Lanzmann film Shoah, which was shown in Poland. By the way, Poland was the only communist country, to my knowledge, to show it. Fragments of it on public TV in a prime time, and all the film in at least one cinema in Warsaw. I don't know if it is shown in other cinemas, but it was shown. And there was a debate, and we have a recent book about it by Martyna Grącka-Ryjak and Jan Olaszek, who have investigated the echoes of this film in the underground, in the illegal publication of the Solidarity movement. And there were many of them, actually more than we knew there were. There was much interest. And what is interesting also that the voices of the underground press were much less critical of the film than the official voices. Polish government condemned the film as anti-Polish. not necessarily uncritical, but much less critical, much more open to investigation of some dark chapters of the Polish Jewish past. Much bigger debate started in 1987 with the publication of an article by Professor Jan Błoński in Tygodnik Powszechny, relatively independent Catholic weekly. And again, I'm not going to cover this debate. It was much bigger in terms of voices and the variety of articles that appear. But the role of historians was rather limited. And those who later on commented upon it noted that this was very much a moral debate, that Błoński introduced a very moral language, which was opening, actually removing certain obstacles which he had identified for the Polish discussions on the shared pasts. But this moral language somehow didn't require very much factual knowledge or historical expertise. However, Tygodnik Powszechny, among the voices published, there were two prominent historians, Teresa Prekerowa and Stanisław Salmonowicz. Teresa Prekerowa is known to anyone who has researched the rescue of Jews in German-occupied Poland. And Stanisław Salmonowicz was a legal historian who published an important book later on the Polish underground state. And they were, what is interesting, they were responding to Stanisław Siła-Nowicki, the main voice critical of Jan Błoński. So you have Jan Błoński, then you have criticism coming from Siła-Nowicki, a prominent lawyer at that time, and Prekerowa and Salmonowicz defend Błoński against Siła-Nowicki. So again, you have historians coming with some modern factual knowledge and supportive of the critical approach to Polish past. What we can learn from the study of Grącka-Rejak and Olaszek, which I have just shown you, is that in the underground publishing, there were relatively many publications on Jewish history or Jewish topics in general that were somehow filling the demand that the official publications could not or were not ready to fill. And in addition to anti-communism, which was obvious in these illegal publications, they were very often critical of anti-Semitism and chauvinism, at least nationalism, integral nationalism. And this is maybe not incidental because many of the key players in the underground movement were Polish 68ers, for whom anti-Semitism was a sign of the communist oppression and communist lie and communist propaganda. But I'm stressing this because only recently I realized how unique it was to have anti-communism that was anti-Semitic. That today anti-communism in Poland has rather a tendency for an apology of anti-Semites, or at least blurring what anti-Semitism in Poland was. At that time, anti-communism was anti-Semitic, and the emergence of a really diverse group of anti-Semites, people who for different reasons believe anti-Semitism is wrong, from liberal social democratic to really conservative and even Catholic nationalists, that was quite a remarkable phenomenon. I think the product of these peculiar circumstances of Poland of the late 1980s. So another coincidence at that time, and here Antony Polonsky entered the scene, is a series of conferences that took place in the 1980s, almost simultaneously to the debates I have just mentioned. Actually, the first one, the initial one, took place in New York at Columbia University already in 1983, although it was not strictly an academic scholarly conference. And Lukasz Krzanovsky, who reported on this conference in the Soviet Jewish Affairs, mentioned some, as he called, political extra scholarly interest that could be felt and intervened, somehow disrupted the conference. So it seems to me, and this is my first question to Anthony, it seems to me that this experience of the Columbia Conference 1983 contributed to making the next conference in 1984, the big Oxford Conference of 1984, with more than 100 scholars present, a strictly academic conference. And this conference was followed by a visit of some 20 plus Israeli scholars to Poland, which was really a novelty. Be reminded that Poland didn't have diplomatic relations with Israel. It was still a communist country. And the conference and this visit contributed, let me quote, to cemented personal ties and the open, frank, and uninhibited nature of the discussion, to quote Anthony report on this conference. And genuine dialogue had been established. The third conference took place in Jerusalem in 1988, further solidifying the bonds of trust and conviction that the frankness, civility, and mutual respect in discussion are not only morally good, but they are also productive in bringing the shared conclusions that participants were looking for. And in the meantime, we have another important event, that means the establishment of the journal Plein Studies in Polish Jewry. And the journals, they are like continuous conferences. You have an ongoing exchange of opinion by scholars. You have reviews, you have articles. So I see it as a continuous conference, originating, by the way, with the 1984 Oxford Conference. And Moshe Rossman once commented upon these meetings that he saw a deliberate negotiation of mutually acceptable version of conflictual past, a consensual, usable past, which was clearly an objective of this historian. So there was a desire to use this certain debates of academic standards to reach shared understanding of a past which was perceived as a conflicted past. There was a lot of disagreement, but there was also an understanding that the opponents in these debates were people of goodwill and mutual respect for them, although there was even a secret informer of the security service at least one of these discussions. These debates were also very much Goldbergian. That means they followed the famous statement by Jacob Goldberg that there is no history of Poland without the Jews and no history of the Jews without Poland. So that was against the insular idea of the Jewish history and the narrow ethno-nationalist idea of the Polish history as the history of ethnic Poles at the same time. And this had some special meaning for the history of the Holocaust, the renewal of the Holocaust research, which was really in very bad condition after 1968, the anti-Jewish campaign and the emigration of many of the historians, Jewish historians from Poland. That means this Goldbergian perspective for Holocaust history meant the end of a separation between the research on the Jewish history during the war, the Holocaust, and the German policies against non-Jews in Poland, because both topics had a quite rich scholarship, especially in the 1960s, but largely isolated, largely unrelated to each other. So I think these were the intellectual foundations for a tendency that we can see later on. So when the Polish historians were called to the Polish debates on the Holocaust in the 1990s and early 2000s, they were coming with a certain mindset. And the part of this mindset was that this is how we do history. There is an international community of scholars, that we share certain values, and we follow certain rules. By the way, the Polonsky debate also attracted attention abroad in the West, and Antony published a selection of the articles from the debate in My Brother's Keeper in 1990, which means that later on Polish scholars knew that such debates, first, they attract interest in the West, and what they write may be read by others abroad, which added this transnational dimension also to Polish debates in the Polish language in Poland. You know, I think there was, in the back of their heads, they had Anthony Polonsky listening and maybe writing about it later on in the journal. So these were the circumstances of the renewal of the Holocaust studies and Jewish studies in Poland. And let me give a small sample, a sample of one, which statistically is not very convincing, but this is my sample. I am an object of inquiry. Namely, In 1988, I decided to write my doctoral dissertation on Ignacy Schwarzbart, a Zionist who was a Jewish representative to the Polish government exile in London during the war. And I did it because Israeli archives had just sent to Warsaw a microfilm of the Schwarzbart collection, which remains in Israel to the present. And that was a part of the Polish-Israeli rapprochement, these new policies of late communist Poland, of rapprochement with Israel, of this opening to transnational cooperation. By the way, the massive presence of Polish scholars in Oxford and then in Jerusalem would have been impossible without the desire of General Jaruzelski to improve the image of the Polish government in the West. He really wanted to improve it. And the image was horrible after the martial law. And especially he wanted to improve the image of Poland in the eyes of the Western bankers. And I suppose some kind of prejudice that Jews controlled international finance was behind the relative liberalization of the policies towards Holocaust research and research on Jewish history in particular. Not all kinds of histories experience this kind of partial liberalization as did the Jewish history in Poland in the 1980s. And I could go to London to dig into the archives of the Polish government exile thanks to a scholarship, which I got thanks to Anthony. So as you see on the small sample of one young scholar, the factors which I'm describing had a very practical consequence. And you can take me as a case of a new generation of scholars, which was then later on educated in the atmosphere which I just presented. And I will give you another example. I met Barbara Engelking, who is now the director of the Polish Center for Holocaust Research, not as a Holocaust scholar. I met her as the member of the same illegal network publishing an underground solidarity bulletin in Warsaw. Mm. So here you have the overlapping of this peculiar culture of underground publishing, certain interest in Jewish history there, and certain respect for critical history, which was already there, and the later on career trajectories of some of the historians. So let me jump now to 1993. As I said, in the Carmel debate, 1989-1990, which was quite hot, historians didn't play any major role. And maybe this is why it was so difficult. It turned out that Polish bishops had a much lesser tendency for an open and frank debate than Polish historians had at that time. So it only took the personal intervention of the Pope John Paul II to actually move the nuns out of the building next to the barbed wire of the Auschwitz camp. So for me, an important debate and less known debate is a debate which started in December 1993 with a short article, actually a review by Michał Cichy of memoirs of Calel Perechodnik, a policeman in the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish policeman in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in this article, Cichy accused the soldiers of the Home Army and the National Armed Forces for killing many Jews during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. And there was a heated debate about it. And then, for the first time, historians were called by the editors of the mass print newspapers. And we see Gazeta Wyborcza, the major national daily of the time, as we read in this newspaper, consulted 10 historians. We don't know who they were, but we know who published with Gazeta Wyborcza. And in the following days, we had Teresa Prekerowa, whom I have mentioned, but also Andrzej Friszke, Włodzimierz Borodziej, Tomasz Strzembosz, and others. So you have eminent historians of the Polish contemporary history, of Polish-Jewish relations, being published in mass circulation newspapers. And they are called not only because of their knowledge of specific events, although that was a problem, because Cichy was speaking about an unknown event in Warsaw of 1943. But I believe they were also called to calm down the debate. The editors of the Gazeta Wyborcza wanted to calm it down because reactions were very negative to the Cichy article. And I believe that at that time, the historians not only brought these factual arguments, but also brought certain idea what it means to make a good history, a quality history. The pattern of calling historians was established, especially the pattern of calling historians to the debates on Polish Jewish past was established, and it was strengthened again 3 years later in a series of articles that followed. Well, it wasn't very much a debate because there was not much division of opinions, but it was very much about the claims of Yafa Eliach, a respected American scholar, who claimed that in 1944, the soldiers of the Home Army organized a pogrom in the town of Wejszyszki and deliberately killed Jewish civilians, the survivors of the Holocaust. So there was some echoes about it in Poland. Historians were called again, and most of them actually were very critical of what Yafa Eliach wrote. And I believe that this strengthened the pattern of calling the historian even among those who were not so much willing for a critical approach to the Polish Jewish past. They realized that, well, academic historians are useful in these debates. So it means that at the end of the 20th century, and we are approaching the moment of the publication of the Neighbors by Jan Tomasz Gross, Poland had a model, a tested model of calling in historians, and had historians ready and willing to speak up in public, while respecting and reproducing the rule of academic debates and the rules of good academic history that they had learned or they had renewed or they had developed since 1980s. And this included also a young generation of scholars who grew up only in the 1980s, 1990s. So an evidence of it is a now forgotten poem published by Gazeta Wyborcza in 1989, and the title of the poem is Advice for a Young Historian of the Second World War. And this is how to write Polish Jewish history of the Second World War, basically. I'm not going to quote it, it's just an evidence that there was a recognized figure of a young historian writing about the Second World War, and especially about the Polish-Jewish relations in the Second World War. So now, speaking about the Jedwabne debate, why I believe, and I follow Piotr Forecki in this belief, that the role of historians in the Jedwabne debate was crucial. First, it began with an essay in historical interpretation. This is the subtitle of the book by Jan Tomasz Gross. Not all the debates begin with scholarly publications, and not all the debates of Polish Jewish history began with scholarly publication. Second, we have a long list of historians who spoke up or wrote about it, both supporters and critics of the book, and the critics of Jan Tomasz Gross. And actually, a desire to have a historian as the opponent of Gross was very much visible among those who rejected the book. So, for example, when Professor Strzembosz wrote a very critical article about it, or interview about it, he was very much welcomed. That means the opponents of Gross wanted to have academic historians speaking on their behalf. Later on, this role was taken by Mr. Chodakiewicz, a Polish-American historian, who was a much lesser figure than Professor Strzembosz, by all means. And it's really, you can very much see the efforts to present Chodakiewicz as an eminent scholar. There was a need, a desire to have an eminent scholar speaking against Jan Tomasz Gross, to somehow counterbalance Gross. During the debate, historians faced unprecedented demand for their knowledge and opinions. So the articles and interviews were printed in mass circulation. I remember my article running in 2 consecutive numbers of Rzeczpospolita. Now, today, no newspaper would have published an article of this sort. I cannot imagine it. It's a size of a scholarly journal. And soon, these articles became an object of analysis themselves. I've mentioned Piotr Forecki book, but there were several studies analyzing these debates. And again, we have Anthony Polonsky coming with Joanna Michlitz, also present, with another selection of the voices in this debate for a Western reader, and that was not the only one. So Andrzej Leder made an interesting point about the role of historians in this debate. Namely, he wrote that historians were perceived as someone who has the power to, quote, resurrect the past events, that they are qualified, more qualified than others to speak about the past. And at that time, I thought it's obvious. Today, I know it's not obvious. that it was something unusual, maybe unique to this time, that the early 21st century was a very special moment, maybe the most fortunate moment to discuss something like the crime in Jedwabne.
Yes.
So how much time do I have?
It would be good if you would wrap up.
Okay. So there were some circumstances other than the development of the Holocaust research in Poland in the 1980s and 1990s. And let me just mention, first was the establishment of the Institute of National Remembrance, the IPN, which today has a very bad press. But let me remind you that when it was established, the director of its research department was Paweł Machcewicz. And the first major publication of the IPN, rather unexpected by its founders, was the 2-volume publication on Jedwabne, which is serious scholarship and a set of documents, very comprehensive, very serious things, which really contributed to the debate somehow. And it was also perceived as official. It was perceived as the official voice because the Institute is a kind of government agency after all. Second, the Jedwabne debate took place in the middle of the Poland's accession process, Poland's accession to the European Union. The accession started formally in 1998, and it was completed by the treaty in 2003. So the debate was exactly in the middle of it. And why I stress it? Because at that time, all major political forces wanted Poland to join the EU. Second, they knew that the recognition of the Holocaust as a very important event in European history is a kind of acquis communautaire, a kind of a pre-requirement to join the Union. And also they knew that Poland doesn't have a good press in terms of Polish-Jewish history abroad. For example, it was used against the expansion of NATO a few years before, that Americans should not be allies of anti-Semites. So politicians, they certainly did not attack harshly the debate, and some of them were very supportive of the debates. To show the, President Kwaśniewski, who went to Jedwabne and spoke quite courageously publicly about it. Third, and lastly, early 21st century was the high moment of the printed press in Poland. At that time, the circulation of the printed press was 3 million copies, of which 1.5 million newspapers, dailies. And Gazeta Wyborcza was the biggest one, was the highest circulation newspaper. It lost the position a few years later. After 2007 begins the steady and steep decline of the newspapers. Now, the news come from the internet. And after 2008, the forum for the discussion is no longer printed media, as it was with the Jedwabne debate, is the social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. And there, the dynamics and the rules of the discussion, the rules that are predefined by the algorithms of the social networks, are very different. So for all these reasons, I believe that early 2000s was a really special moment to make historians so much influential in the most important public debate on history in Poland ever, and that the way the historians acted at that time to large extent reflected a foundation that had been established already in the 1980s by the people like Anthony Polonsky. Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for this very, very ambitious survey. I would like to mention that from the chat that there is a mention of a conference which took place in Krakow in 1986, dedicated to the autonomy of Jews in early modern Poland, one of the other iconic early conferences establishing the field of Eastern European studies. I think we lost Dariusz for a moment. I'm not sure whether Dariusz is with us.
He's back.
He's back. Very good. So there's another question. I take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question myself. Dariusz, in 1978, Jan Paweł II is the first Polish Pope, Karol Wojtyła. I remember that I would attend lectures for example, by Helena Dartner in the basement of churches. Please discuss the role of the Catholic Church and especially the Klub Inteligencji Katolickiej, the role of the Catholic Intelligence Club.
So again, thank you very much for this question. I have not mentioned the church, but I maybe should have mentioned together with the underground publishing milieus. And somehow a unique situation, when you have anti-communists being anti-Semitic, you have a Roman Catholic clergy in an East European country being also anti-Semitic. Not all of them, but enough of them to make a difference.
Yeah.
And if I was to name a single person who contributed to this change, that was certainly John Paul II. And we see it much clearly today because of how much it has changed. So it was a long-term process. It didn't change everything, but it did change a lot. And at that time, the church was in general much more open to new ideas coming from outside. And also it was a kind of a practical alliance with secular intelligentsia against the communists. So it had not only spiritual foundation, but very practical purposes. And it was effective. This is the way how the communist dictatorship in Poland was abolished eventually, by this coalition of bishops and Adam Michnik.
A question from Tom Griffiths. Do you see any connection in the 1990s between the historical and public debates over Jedwabne, which was published later, however, with that over Katyn, the iconic role of the Katyn massacre? Is this how does this resonate in the context of Polish Jewish history?
Well, these were separate debates, but I think they have a common root. Namely, a desire that was developed especially in the 1980s, a desire for filling the so-called blank spots in history. The pages that were taboo under the communist regime, like Katyn, and they developed a whole culture or a set of values that truth about the past is a value in itself, which was later on applied to the Polish Jewish history and the Holocaust history.
Yes, indeed. One should perhaps mention the really exceptional museum for Katyn in Warsaw, which was opened not that long ago and which is under visited museum, I think. A question, the last question we can take by Piotr Feretsky. You are the author of an in-depth book on the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968. Do you see any analogy between the instrumental use of the subject of the Polish righteous at that time and the current instrumentalization in Poland to cover up, whitewash Polish complicity in the Holocaust?
Of course, and there are people who cover this topic in detail. I mean, the contemporary abuse of the figure of the righteous. And we have heard today from Joanna Michlitz about this massive museum to be established by Father Rydzyk, who was the most important supporter of anti-Semitic ideas in Polish radio not such a long time ago. By the way, he stopped spreading openly anti-Semitic content after Shabbat dinner with an Israeli diplomat a few years ago, which is also remarkable. But there are striking similarities, but the contemporary experience of living in Poland today helps me better understand 1968 in Poland rather than the other way around. Yes. Namely, I think I can say it. I have a plan to going back to the topic, write the book again with a hypothesis that 1968 was not just any ethno-nationalism. It was a populist nationalism. It means the populist component of the 68 campaign was much more important than I thought when I was writing the book. And I understood it only facing the populists today, with the key claim that you have bad elites, alienated elites, parasitic elites, and the good people, ordinary people. And how Polish Jews at that time were very much educated, small, very much educated group fit into this image. So I would rather project the knowledge accumulated in the recent years in Poland on 1968 than the other way around.
Yes, yes. certainly will be an inspiring reading. Thank you so much, Dariusz Stola, for your expertise and for sharing these insights about the role of the historian in shaping debates about the legacy of war and Holocaust. And this is the moment I would like to hand over to Antony Polonsky and invite the historian of Polish Jewish history to share his thoughts about what we discussed overall in the course of this workshop, and especially in the context of the politicization of the legacy of the Holocaust in recent years. So I invite Antony to the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of the people who participated in this very important discussion and for all the kind words that have been said about me. I'll take as my jumping off point Dariusz's very interesting presentation. As he pointed out in his last remarks, the sort of history which flourished in the 1990s and goes back somewhat further, and which achieved so much, was based on the idea that society is made up of different and often competing groups in which understandings of the past may differ, and in which a reckoning with the negative aspects of the national history is necessary for building a pluralistic, outward-looking and tolerant society. This was what we all believed, the Strzemboszes as much as people like us. This point of view, or this view of what history should be doing, has come under fire from the populists, who of course are in power at present, and as Dariusz said, have been able to establish themselves in a strong position. For them, history is centered on the nation and the community on which it's composed. This is primordial, it's always existed, and it transcends the intransient individuals of which it's comprised. For these people, history is important because it's the biography of the national community and the source of the traditions and values that hold everything together. For instance, the Institute for National Memory, which, as Dariusz correctly pointed out, started in a very different form, in its new transformation in 2016, defined the goal of historical studies as follows. Historical policy refers to the interpretation of facts, lives, and events, and is assessed according to the interests of the society and the nation as an element that has a long-range character and constitutes the foundation of state policy. Historical policy is a type of history that serves to shape the historical consciousness of society, including economic and territorial consciousness, as well as to strengthen public discourse about the past in the direction of nurturing national bonds, regardless of the momentary policies of the state. And obviously, I just underline what's been said in that, the issue is not historical truth as such. Instead, history is important because it is, quote, the long-range foundation of the state. It is those stories that a community tells itself and retells itself in order to establish a bond between generations and to teach young people what we believe. Dariusz already mentioned that one of the features of populism is they see themselves as we, whereas we are seen as somehow not really national. It's one of those factors that must never be contested or debated. And I think that Mary Fulbrook was quite right that we need to see this issue on a regional and indeed on a larger basis. If we just talk about the region, although obviously one could extend this to Central and to Western Europe as well and to the rest of the world, it's clear that official custodians of memory in Lithuania and Ukraine, and such as the Genocide and Resistance Research Center in Lithuania and the Center for Research and of the Liberation Movement in Ukraine, are also committed to this sort of history and indeed enjoy some support from their respective governments. The situation has changed slightly in recent months in Ukraine, but I haven't time to go into that. The same process can be observed in Belarus, although it's less pronounced and it often takes a neo-Soviet form. In Germany too, the more liberal concept of historical scholarship does seem to be holding its own, but it is also under pressure. And we've seen in recent months how the Russian government has attempted to advance its interests through the use of a falsified patriotic history. I would stress here, in the interest of dialogue, that there is considerable common ground between these two understandings of how history should be written. If we think of the United Kingdom, obviously a self-critical and a patriotic history do exist side by side. And it is important, I think, not to demonize the historians of whom one disapproves. There is a role both for a patriotic history, which celebrates the achievements of the nation, and for one which points out the mistakes and wrongdoings committed in the past. It was the English historian Edward Gibbon who wrote, "History is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind." Indeed, dealing with the difficult problems of the past, we need to base our work on the careful use of primary material, as was, I think, done in much of the presentations today. Governments should understand that these are complex issues. Although official support for historical study is to be welcomed, this is best carried out in universities and academic research bodies, independent of direct state intervention. Just as truth is the first casualty in war, so complexity is the first casualty in historical wars. And here I would also add that I do understand that individuals have the right to seek redress if they are libeled. But I am very uncomfortable with the idea that the right of suing for libel or defamation should extend beyond the person directly affected, who obviously can speak for him or herself and who can reach some resolution with the people who are alleged to have defamed or libeled him or her, to members of his or her family and to the larger community. And also that it should be formulated in a way in which one of the reasons you can be libeled is as a member of the Polish nation, which is how it was formulated in the recent case. The idea that judges should decide very complicated questions of historical scholarship is a very problematic one, and I fear very much how this will develop in the future, not to speak of the present situation which we face in relation to the demand that Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski apologize for stating that Mr. Edward Malinowski stole goods from the person who he was hiding, Estera Grudnicka, and that he was instrumental in betraying some Jews. These are matters which the evidence is extremely unclear on and in which it's very difficult to reach a final conclusion. I would also say that to respond to the new intellectual climate in the context of the general rise of populism, which is going to be difficult to defeat as well, is not going to be easy. One would like to believe that there's a reverse Gresham's law in historical scholarship, that good history drives out bad. And this seems to be what was happening in the 90s and the in the first decade of the 20th century. Certainly, there are many scholars in the countries of Eastern Europe and elsewhere who have made a major contribution to a nuanced, archival-based and dispassionate account of the difficult problems of the Holocaust. And we've seen some of them presenting their work today. We need to continue to pursue this approach and to find ways of reaching a wider transnational audience. In this respect, I very much feel that it is very important to move beyond the national framework into a transnational framework. One of the features of the area between Germany and ethnic Russia is that this is an area where nations were in competition with each other and where nation and class often overlapped. In Eastern Galicia, for example, the landowners were Polish and the peasants were Ukrainian. In Lithuania, the same situation applied. In Belarus, again, this happened. In Western Poland, the landowners were, for the most part, German-speaking. The peasants were Polish. There was a series of articles recently in Gazeta Wyborcza in which somebody from Upper Silesia compared himself to slaves or compared his ancestors to slaves in the United States. And this aroused a strong response from a Radziwill who said that it was wrong to pass on guilt by genetics. But nevertheless, the point is that in this area, the different nations were in competition with each other, and this determined in many ways the somewhat nuanced the relations, their response to the Nazi occupation. Some saw more advantage to themselves in working with the Nazis. Others had very little opportunity for large-scale collaboration. The whole question of collaboration, of course, whether in Poland or the areas east of Poland, is also one which needs to be dispassionately discussed. But I think it's very important for this issue to be discussed on a transnational basis, as Kopstein dealt with in his discussion of pogroms, and as other people have also attempted to do, because it gets one beyond this idea that what we are doing here is an attempt to darken or blacken the name of the nation. One of the book covers which Piotr Foretsky showed this is the book by Kurek, in which Poland is on its knees, just waiting to rise up from its knees against the policy of humiliating the country by attributing all manner of evils to the Polish nation. These are problems which were the result of specific historical conditions, and they were similar over the whole of the area. So I think we need to look for nuanced, archival-based and dispassionate history, which will enable us to move back to a situation in the 1990s and the early decades of the 20th century, 21st century, when these issues could be discussed in a rational manner between different individuals and in which a degree of civility could prevail. We need also to reach out to a larger audience. This is one of the goals of the museum in which both Dariusz and I were involved, in which Dariusz played a major role. And this, I think, will show how similar situations gave rise to similar reactions, and that the issue is not one of a unique national guilt. And I think also useful here is the concept of conceptualization, which helps to explain the complicated and contradictory nature of the Holocaust, how people could at the same time be both rescuers and denounced Jews, and that it can be studied in a transnational manner. In addition, I think that we should take as a model in our analysis the notion of integrated history as practiced by Charles Friedlander. In addition, I think also it's important to find an answer to more moderate critics of our scholarship, of what we can describe as critical history, who've claimed that it devotes excessive attention to the dark past and to the Holocaust and the suffering of Jews in particular, that it's insufficiently positive. Dariusz will remember people saying that I think it was Minister Dariusz, that the Holocaust Gallery in the museum did not give sufficiently positive lessons. Whether you can find positive lessons in the Holocaust is another matter. Obviously, these are cliches, and I'll finish with a cliche, but I think that our goal should be to encourage scholarship based on a wide range of sources from a variety of points of view in different locations. And it's a hope that we will, in this way, make it possible to integrate the history of the Holocaust into the larger issue of the successes and failures of Jewish integration in the history of Europe, and will also make it possible to strengthen civic society and democratic values in the countries of East Central Europe, where, particularly in Hungary and Poland, but well, not even particularly in Hungary and Poland, where these values are everywhere under threat and where they need to be reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. We would like to invite the audience to think about questions and contributions to our discussion by taking to the floor. Please, in case you would like to join the discussion, you may do so by raising the hand. If you go to the lower bar, you have a button called reactions where you can raise your hand. So I encourage you to do so. And while you think about a very smart contribution to this discussion, let me ask Anthony one obvious question. How do we engage with a situation where we actually are not sitting in a seminar room in a university or in a cafe reading a paper, but we are in a situation where a quite powerful player, namely the state with huge resources, is taking to the floor? and using massive means to impact on the discussion. I think particularly of the current attempt to contribute to a notion of good neighborhood, dobre sąsiedztwo, between Jews and Poles, and the already alluded to strong emphasis on the righteous among the nations. And this is carried through through means like the EPN, with hundreds of professional members of staff and institutions which pretend to be academic institutions and but do not really fulfill the criteria of that. How do we engage in this discussion under these extremely unequal conditions?
I'd like to get Dariusz's response as well. It's very difficult to give an easy answer. There is no easy answer. I think that you'll remember that Dariusz quoted Campo de Fiori. In the last verse of Campo de Fiori, which I'll quote because I was thinking about it, Milosz writes, until he describes how people dispute what happened to Giordano Bruno. And then he finishes by saying, until when all is legend and many years have passed, on a new Campo de Fiori, rage will kindle at a poet's word. So this is a long-term process. It's not going to end quickly. As the whole question of what sort of political system we have in Poland is not going to end quickly. I think that we have to strengthen liberal and democratic values. We have to maintain these values. We have to defend the freedom of the press, which is clearly under attack at present, given the hope that Orlen will take over Rzeczpospolita and some of the independent radio and television stations. And we need to continue to pursue the sort of history which Dariusz very eloquently described in his presentation. But it is difficult because obviously the government has huge resources at its disposal. I'm a believer in dialogue. I would like to be able to have dialogue with the EPN. And there are people in the EPN with whom obviously it should be possible to speak. But at present, I'm not sure how this dialogue will work. And, I'm afraid that we tend to talk to each other. And I grew up in the South Africa of the 1950s. Nobody could see in the 1950s how apartheid would be easily overthrown. This was particularly true. This is why I abandoned liberalism and became a Marxist-Leninist. In liberal circles, the liberals sat around saying how bad things were and how I couldn't do anything about it. And this is a situation which I'm afraid we may be in now, but it will change. The same was true in Poland at that time. Poland, the communist system seemed invincible, yet it collapsed or had to negotiate an end of communism in 1989-91. In South Africa, there was a negotiated end to apartheid. So no system can live forever. But I don't know, maybe Dariusz has a different answer.
Please, Dariusz.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful, and hope is a virtue, is not expectation. And I'm not so much optimistic because it's not only a Polish problem. Poland is not the only country that has or had recently a government that wanted to make Polish past great again. There are other powerful political movements and leaders who want to make the past of a country great again. So this is a global tendency. And I stress at the end the key role of the media that are used in any public debate. And the threat of the revolution in communication that happened in the last years. By the way, Facebook Poland opened in 2008. And after 2010, I don't remember any constructive public debate on any topic. So maybe this is not just coincidence. I believe we have a major problem in terms of education. That means that people who are ready and willing to distort history have powerful means to do it. And they use the taxes I pay to do it. We don't have an intellectual challenge, namely the history they produce is such a bad quality that I don't see as an intellectual challenge, cognitive. It's at the level of propaganda, rather than at the level of having sound narratives. And this is the big difference to the communist regime, let's say in the early 1950s, when many smart people could believe in certain ideas coming from the Soviet Union, and the communism in the 1980s, when they no longer could believe in any ideas coming from the Soviet Union. So what my understanding of what is the proper strategy in this difficult times was that we are retreating, that you have powerful forces pushing ahead, offensive and having initiative. And when you retreat, at least this is what I learned during my military service in communist Poland, you do two things. You slow down the advance of the enemy and you maximize his losses. So I think we were slowing down the advance, but you need someone prepare a counteroffensive. I think historians are not to make any counteroffensive. We hope for a political change, for the end of this wasteful and distortionist policies of the IPN. Yes, there are, as Anthony said, there are some good historians still working there, keeping low profile to work there. But the leadership of this institution clearly doesn't care about what really did happen in Poland. It cares about the pride and the glory of the Polish and the feeling good. This is why it sells so well. So maybe we should just follow the strategy that was developed in the 1980s. That means maintain a relatively small group of scholars who respect certain values, who practice certain values like critical historical investigation and the open and frank debate where you respect your opponents, and until a better moment. But this better moment must come by someone else's actions rather than actions of historians.
I mean, there's a question in the chat about the role of social media, and I share your skepticism, Dariusz, that social media will save us because we talk to each other a bit like we talk to each other today. I would like to mention here a great thinker of political change, Antonio Gramsci, who spoke about cultural hegemony. When I started as an undergraduate student in Warsaw in the early 1980s, there was cultural hegemony, and it did not lie with the communist regime, although the communist regime had all the cards. So the question is, how do we regain cultural hegemony of society and including these historical debates? I don't think that we as historians can separate ourselves and retreat into the famous ivory tower. We need to be also joining other debates, social debates, and we need to save. I think we need to save the public sphere. I mean, Timothy Snyder, who's with us today, has developed this thought with great eloquence that defending democracy in the first place has to do with defending the public sphere, and obviously what we have been doing what historians have been doing in the context of thinking about the Holocaust and the legacy of the war was to speak about unpleasant things, but speaking to a variety of audiences and engage a variety of audiences. Okay. Anthony is asked by Professor Galiński whether historians are at the forefront or in the front line of this battle to save historical memory, if you want.
Well, I think that I agree with Dariusz. It's important for academic historians to continue to do the sort of work which we've done in the past, and which has certainly transformed our understanding of the history of East Central Europe and the history of the Jews in East Central Europe in the last 35 years. A huge amount has been done. And this Felix Scharf, who was, of course, the secretary of Ignacy Schwarzbart, so this is one of the connections between Dariusz and myself, used to say, one of his favorite expressions was scripta manent. What has been written remains. But I do think there is a problem with social media. I agree with Dariusz on this. I don't think we've worked out how, I mean, it's a new print medium, and it has many wonderful benefits, including the fact that we're able to conduct this seminar in the way that we have been doing today. But I mean, there's a lot on Facebook. Twitter is more problematic, but Facebook as a way of exchanging opinions and posting material has many virtues, but it's not controlled. And it's like print in its absolutely early stages, that the negative consequences of the totally free situation are very obvious, and we've seen them. Dariusz already talked about the United States. I mean, the way in which these media, particularly Twitter, were used, it was clearly highly deleterious. And how one is going to deal with that, it's not a problem for historians as such. It's a problem for those who believe in liberal democratic values and the preservation of some sort of constitutional system. How does one control these forms of exchange? They can't be put back in the box. The box is open. The technology is there. There's no way you can stop it. And it has many good aspects to it, but we need to find a way of limiting the harmful aspects of its influence.
There's a very interesting question going back to some parts of our discussion today, where the role of the Catholic Church is today. I mean, I reminded of the fact that the Church was obviously offering shelter to debates in the 1980s, was a major factor in bringing about political and societal change. Where is the Catholic Church today, Dariusz, or perhaps Professor Polonsky, or whoever thinks he or she is qualified? Dariusz. You are muted, Dariusz.
Okay, yes. Now I'm unmuted. It's not only that the Church offered shelter for these debates in the 1980s. It was not incidental that Jan Błoński published in Tygodnik Powszechny, which was a Catholic weekly. And then Fear, the second best-known book by Jan Tomasz Gross, was also published by Znak, another Catholic publisher. And it's not incidental, in a country where you have more than 90% of people being formally Catholic, that you have both Father Rydzyk, who was more than happy to spread anti-Jewish prejudice in his radio station and his newspaper, and people of very different opinions. However, I'm afraid that the Catholic Church, and in particular Catholic hierarchy, have much more pressing and urgent problems to shift attention and to help us with the quality of the teaching on Polish Jewish history, for example. Polish Church has entered a period of the most serious crisis since the Trento Concile, since the Counter-Reformation, probably. Something I haven't seen and haven't expected, and I wouldn't expect the leaders of the Polish Church coming with help at present. I would be glad if they could order some of the priests not to spread hostility and prejudice. That would be most that I would ask for, rather than some positive statements. But I would like to comment on Antony. Well, there is a chance in this historically unprecedented power of a few men in Palo Alto, California, who own and control the social networks. By email to an IT engineer, they can change the algorithm, which means they can change what we see and what we read on Facebook or Twitter. This is really unprecedented. This is a power that no publisher of a printed press has ever had. Even the publisher of a TV channel has ever had. So, and I'm afraid that if they don't do something, we will not only lose their ability for a frank and civil debate on Polish Jewish history, but we may lose democracy in general. It reminds me, of course, it's difficult because Facebook makes more than $5 billion profit quarterly. So why to change the algorithm if you make so much money out of it? But it reminds me what Comrade Lenin said about the capitalists, that they will sell the rope with which we will hang them. So it seems now the capitalists are sending the rope to populists, and the rope are the algorithm of the social networks. However, I think, yes, we can change it. And maybe this is responsibility of the Americans present in this room, in this Zoom gathering, because it happened that Palo Alto is in California. I cannot change it. I remember when a vice president of Facebook visited Plein Museum, and he was very kind and asked me how he can help. Really very much interested. His grandfather was from Lithuania, so it was his family museum. I was selling it at least at his family museum. And after some discussion, I said that the best thing he can do to save this museum and the world was to change the algorithm, which is not impossible. You can do it.
Thank you. That's very thoughtful. Anthony, please.
Well, I'm not a Catholic, so in a way my comments on the church are from a certain amount of ignorance. I read a very interesting article in the latest TLS about why the Catholic Church in Ireland lost its political and social influence. And I think if one looks at a number of countries, Quebec, Spain, Ireland, even Italy, you can see that for various reasons, a certain type of clericalism has become unpopular. And I think that the same is happening more slowly in Poland. I think that the process of secularization is proceeding. I don't think that the Supreme Court amendment to the abortion law is popular. And I think that the behavior of the church hierarchy to some extent reflects what Dariusz said, that they feel under considerable pressure. And how this pressure will work out is not at all clear. This is an issue, if you follow Polish politics, which divides the Porozumienia, the main, what used to be the main opposition party, which can't really, where you have people who would like to support complete ban on abortion and others who are against this. This issue is still to be resolved in Poland, but I mean, I think that a process of secularization is continuing, and we have to see how this works out in the longer term.
Thank you. I will take one last question, which is in the chat from Wojtek Apak to both Dariusz and Anthony as panelists, namely, how do you see the future of the Plein Museum, which has been such a crucial arena for engaging with both the history of the Holocaust and the wider history of Polish Jewish civilization? Dariusz, you go perhaps first.
Well, first is the question of how do we see the future of any museum after the pandemics? I mean, this is the major crisis of all cultural institutions in the world now. You have thousands of museums closed now for almost a year. And for Plein Museum, it means you have 160 employees and you don't have 25% of your revenue. And you know, for at least, you know, Plein is a public museum, so which is relatively stable financially, but many other museums will simply never reopen. Mm. So this is one. The known unknown. Will people come back to the cultural institutions if and when we will have effective vaccination of a large share of the population? Second is will Plein remain relatively independent to the end of the rule of Mr. Kaczynski party? Because the pandemics, it has many bad effects, but one good effect was they have other urgent business than taking over the museums. So it's very much about time. Thanks to our colleague in the Gdańsk Museum of Second World War, who kept the government of peace of Mr. Kaczynski busy for more than a year, the attack against Plein Museum started later. So now it's again a question of time. What will happen before the next elections, and will peace lose the next elections? We don't know it. And third is this major change. The government of Kaczynski may go, but what the seeds of prejudice and hatred are there. That means it's not difficult to go into Polish internet on various fora and see what people write about the Jews, write about the Holocaust history, write about critical historians. It will take years to remove the rubble, to clear the damage that has been done. For the time being, we are involved rather in kind of a damage control effort, how to minimize the damage that is going on. And 2018 with the infamous Holocaust complicity law was probably the lowest moment in this effort, but it may easily come back. The people who were pushing for this legislation in 2018 are still in prominent positions there. So the future is rather than clear. The question is, the defense strategy applied so far effective? I think it is effective. That means the cost of seeing me having a lot of time to ride my bicycle around Poland was a reasonable price to accept to defend the independence of the institution. And I am pretty sure that Zygmunt Stępiński, my successor, he's continuing with the strategy that we have jointly developed a few years ago. And he has, as I said, bigger problems than political pressure, and this big problem is the pandemics.
Yeah. Thank you, Dariusz. Anthony, you talk.
Well, I agree with everything Dariusz has said. The problem is what will happen to museums after the pandemic. And the fact is that the government has other problems on its plate at present. These are not going to go away. But the climate of opinion in Poland is not what it was in the first decades of the 21st century. Piotr Forecki quoted, public opinion surveys shouldn't really be taken too seriously, but according to one public opinion poll recently, 40% of the population believe that people who in historical writing blacken the good name of Poland should be prosecuted. That's quite a high figure. 20% said that the Nazis were terrible, but after all, they did remove the Jews from Polish society. These are alarming figures. And if you look at the way in which the Cebos polls have gone on these issues, there is a downward trend, and one has to counteract this. Poland is not Hungary. It has a free press still. The free press, Gazeta Wyborcza in particular, the free radio, the free television stations, TVN, the free radio stations, Radio Z, are doing a wonderful job. But the question is, can they withstand? And here, the extent to which the previous American president was committed to the freedom of press in Poland was somewhat limited, to put it no higher. And the present American administration has its own problems. And one situation which is very different today is that the Israeli political scene is not that optimistic, and the hope or the belief that Israeli pressure, as happened in 2018, for all his faults, Netanyahu did reach some sort of agreement with Morawiecki. You can criticize that agreement, but I personally felt it was the best that was possible. It wasn't followed up in the correct way by either side, but nevertheless, it's very difficult to envisage that situation recurring today. And that, of course, also gives the government a great deal of freedom of maneuver. they don't have to worry about the world Jewish response at present, I would say.
Thank you. I think at this point, I will thank all the speakers today, and obviously also those on the last panel, Dariusz and Anthony, for their contributions. We are negotiating with my dear neighbor in office and colleague, Michael Berkowitz, editor of Jewish Historical Studies, whether we can publish the proceedings of this workshop as part of this scholarly journal, which would be wonderful because it is open access and reaches a very wide range of readers across the world. Speaking about the public sphere we need to defend and strengthen. I'm very grateful for all the very thoughtful and substantial contributions today. And I hand back to the Wiener Holocaust Library and Toby Simpson, its director, to conclude our today's proceedings.
Thank you so much, Francois, and thank you for chairing that final panel and for leading such a stimulating discussion. All three panels today have been fascinating to listen to. It's been my privilege to hear from so many impressive scholars, and I've learned a huge amount. I'll be taking away food for thought, but also some acquisition leads. You can't stop a librarian or archivist from thinking about how to gather more interesting stuff. And I think my colleagues will be especially keen to augment our collections on the politics of Holocaust memory in Poland. So I'd really like to thank Piotr, Lukasz and Hannah for giving talks on that subject, and also for their presentations more generally. And also to thank Agnieszka, Katarzyna, Joanna, Mary and Dariusz for presentations which were all eye-opening and thought-provoking. So truly thank you from the library. The Holocaust in Eastern Europe is, of course, an immense and challenging topic. So to convene such an engaging, lively, enlightening day of papers is truly an impressive achievement. So I'd like to thank Francois, Christine and Michael for bringing the symposium together today. And as Francois said, this was long in the planning, and a huge amount of thought and hard work has gone into preparing for it. And I think it's handsomely paid off. So on behalf again of the library, I'd offer my profound thanks. And I'm really confident that today's conversations are going to lead to many more fruitful discussions and connections in the weeks and months to come. And I want to finish by paying a concluding tribute to Professor Antony Polonsky. And as Dariusz Stola showed, he's been a crucial leading light in the field for many decades, and he continues to inspire us all. And I think that sort of helps us to look towards the future. And I'll join Dariusz in being hopeful, if not optimistic. And today has very much been a reason to be hopeful. Hopeful that the transnational efforts to confront this history honestly, led by independent professional historians, will continue to thrive. And I'd just say in conclusion, I think it's appropriate to end by saying thank you to the over 100 participants from all over the world for joining, but above all, thank you to Professor Antony Polonsky for being the inspiration for today's event.
Well, let me just say in conclusion to thank everybody again for this wonderful event. And I'm humbled and honored by all the tributes that were paid to me. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us to a good conclusion. So I just, yes, with applause to Professor Polonsky, I wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you.